The overriding tale of the world of Ice and Fire centers around the return of much that was lost in the centuries prior. Here at Wizards and Warriors, we echo that sentiment, and believe that the events of the present can only be truly understood within the lens of a full grasp of what has come before. In our previous videos on George R.R. Martin's grand fantasy world, we have kept our focus on the continent of Westeros and the timeline of the main book series. In this new video, we will travel to the east, to the continent of Essos, and we'll talk about the rise and fall of Valyrian, the wars of the Dragon Lords fought against the Old Geese and Rhoynar, and how their empire was destroyed. One can get so immersed in these fantasy worlds that you might forget there's actually an even bigger and richer world to explore. Which world is that? You're living on it right now, and so you don't forget next time, pick yourself up a nice globe from our sponsor Mova Globes. These aren't ordinary globes, they gently spin entirely on their own. That's because they absorb solar energy from the room's ambient light to power a magnetic rotation system hidden inside. Without any wires or batteries, see the whole world spin on by with this amazing decoration. It's all powered by a newly developed first-of-its-kind technology. The mechanism is invisible, but the effect is clear to see. Combine it with a choice of bases for a unique ornament, or admire it up close as it spins in your hands. And it doesn't need to be a globe of Earth. Mova globes have plenty of other planets to choose from, and even a few things that aren't planets, with over 40 designs in all. There's sure to be something you'll like, or a perfect gift for the person who has everything. Go to movaglobes.com to see the full selection, link in the description. Then get 10% off a 6 or 8.5 inch Mova globe by using our code Wizards and Warriors. Our tale begins some 2,000 years before Aegon the Conqueror landed on Westeros' shores, and 3,000 years after the long night plunged the world into darkness. During this ancient time, the inhabitants of the Valyrian Peninsula were composed of naught more than shepherds who eked out a life of rugged subsistence. This, however, would change when the Valyrians discovered the existence of dragons, which dwelt within the 14 Flames. The primitive and uncivilized Valyrians believed that these dragons were children of the volcanoes, while Asshai sources claim that they were brought to Valyria from the Shadowlands. Irrespective of the origin of these mighty beasts, the Valyrians were able to tame the dragons using a form of magic believed to have been taught to them by a now vanished people of Asshai descent. Once domesticated, the dragons were bred and raised for war, providing steeds of immense strength and power, transforming the provincial shepherds of Valyria into would-be conquerors. The initial consolidation of the peninsula proved to be a fruitful task for the Valyrians, allowing them to experiment with the winged warfare and aerial dominance which was to define the existence of the Valyrian freehold. The freehold was formally established with the construction of the capital city of Valyria. The skyline of this wonder of the ancient world was dominated by topless towers of unfathomable heights, allowing the dragon riders easy access to their mounts. Sphinxes hewn from stone gazed down upon the denizens of the lower depths of the city through garnet-encrusted eyes. Amongst the hustle and bustle of this fair city were the great smiths of Valyria, whose mastery of magic allowed them to infuse simple steel with tremendous strength and sharpness. This resulted in the creation of Valyrian steel, a much sought-after commodity due to the advantage provided against any other forged blade, bar perhaps that of the meteorite-forged greatsword Dawn of House Dane. Despite the freehold's extreme prosperity, it had not yet been truly tested on the field of battle. That test would soon come in the form of the Old Empire of Ghis. Old Ghis was founded by Ghiscari the Great, a near-mythological figure who remains revered by the aristocratic families of Slavers Bay to the present day. Ghiscari had formed the lockstep legions of Old Ghis, who were composed of highly disciplined, well-armed free men from Ghiscar in central Essos. Each man would wield a shield and 3 spears, and their name was derived from the fashion in which they marched together with perfect cohesion. At the head of his lockstep legionaries, Ghiscari formed a mighty empire, colonizing the surroundings of Old Ghis and subjugating the fledgling civilizations in their vicinity. As a result, Ghiscari was able to raise a mighty capital city surrounded by formidable brick walls and boasting a sizable population. As a civilization, Old Ghis predated the rise of Valyria by thousands of years. Ghiscari primary sources claim the empire had already been founded even before the Long Night had begun. This led the Ghiscari to believe they were the inheritors of the world's oldest civilization. For although civilizations, including the realm of the Fisher Queens and the forebears of Sarnor, are believed to have existed during the Dawn Age, no written records of such were kept. While the records of civilizations like Yti and Ashai remain wholly inaccessible to anyone not of those domains. The 5 Ghiscari Wars, which were to come, would forever alter the composition of Essos and the political reality of what would shape the continent's future. Historical sources are unclear when the First Ghiscari War broke out. However, they remain consistent that the war occurred just after the initial rise of Valyria. During this time, the Ghiscari Empire was undergoing a phase of expansion. Not content with the possessions they already controlled, they pushed west, and even built pyramids in the Gulf of Grief, not far from the Valyrian peninsula. At the same time, the emergent freehold began to spread further than the extent of their home peninsula, and it was in this expansion that the implacable lockstep legions would meet the overwhelming fire of the Valyrian dragons. In this first conflict, the aged empire was unable to contain the expansion of the younger freehold, yet the Valyrians were as of yet incapable of landing a killing blow. The Second Ghiscari War would involve a new player, which would be forced to take a side with either the Old Empire or the Freehold. The Kingdom of Sarnor was an ancient polity centered around the mighty San River and the tributaries, which acted as arteries of the fledgling kingdom. The Tall Men, as the Sarnori referred to themselves, traced their lineage back to the mythological figure of Ō'hÁinle, a being descended from the last of the Fisher Queens of the Silver Sea. According to legend, Ō'hÁinle took the daughters of the great rulers of the Chimeri as his wives, turning his people and theirs into the Tall Men. However, scholarly thought questions whether this figure of Ō'hÁinle was merely devised as a mythic replacement for the true tale, which involved a more mundane, brutalistic story of conquest and assimilation. For most of their history, the Sarnori were a prideful and quarrelsome peoples who tended towards disunity and prolonged wars against the neighbouring Kathi. The majority of these wars were won by the Sarnori, which forced the Kathi to settle in the southern end of the Bone Mountains, the only settlement to survive of which was the prosperous Karth. Immediately prior to their involvement in the Ghiscari Wars, Sarnor would trade with Valyria, Yti, Leng and Ashai, while warring with the old Ghiscari Empire. Sarnor's lingering bad blood with the Ghiscari ultimately led them to pick the right horse in the ongoing war between Old Ghis and Valyria, when they sided with the Valyrians in the Second Ghiscari War and helped the Dragon Riders achieve victory. The Sarnori would again come to the aid of their Dragon Lord allies in the Third Ghiscari Wars, riding their war chariots into battle against the Ghiscari lockstep legions as the tide firmly turned against the Old Empire. At this point, the war had taken on a transcontinental flavour, with hostilities breaking out between the colonies of the Old Empire and Freehold in far-off areas of the world. Ghiscari colonies across the Summer Sea, in the Basilisk Isles, and upon the mysterious continent of Sothorios were assaulted by the Valyrian coalition. The colony of Gorgai, founded by the Ghiscari upon the Isle of Tears, was annexed by the Valyrians, turned into a brutal penal colony, and renamed Gorgasos. The very worst criminals were sent to this island for experimentation with blood magic. Rumours which persisted for long after the Third War involved hideous experiments, including forcing slave women to mate with beasts, which produced an awful, twisted, half-human form of being known as a chimera. The Fourth Ghiscari War was fought against a much depleted Old Empire of Ghis. Yet all was not lost for the beleaguered lockstep legions, for aid was coming their way. The Kingdom of Sarnor, for the entirety of its existence, remained prone to division and discord, manifesting in the fact that they were rarely if ever politically united. As such, during the Fourth Ghiscari War, rival Sarnori kings fought on either side of the Valyrian-Ghiscari conflict, often using the war as an opportunity to mete out revenge for petty grievances amongst one another. Yet even this discord within Valyria's traditional allies was not enough to put a stop to the irrepressible Freehold. In the Fourth Ghiscari War, the colony of Zamitar, which represented the only major city upon the rugged and untamable continent of Sothorios, was annexed by the Valyrians. The final Ghiscari War took place in or around the year 4700 BC and represented the final gasping breath of the ancient empire, for no longer could its lockstep legions hold back the might of the Valyrian dragon riders. The last of the legions were decimated as the Valyrian freehold swept aside all which stood before it. At this point, with no field armies left to defend the lands of the Old Empire, the Valyrians descended upon the capital city of Old Ghis. The great brick walls, erected by Ghiscari the Great himself, were laid low, and the city was razed to the ground, leaving nothing more than ash. To ensure that nothing could ever grow there again, the fields surrounding the city were sown with salt, lime, and skulls. This fifth and final war had devastating consequences on the Ghiscari peoples, a vast number of whom were slain, with many more taken enslaved. Many of these slaves were taken to the mines which had been established beneath the 14 Flames, dying horrible deaths through the brutal conditions which were imposed by their overlords. The domains which had long made up the heartland of the Old Empire of Ghis were incorporated into the Valyrian freehold, and their resident Ghiscari were assimilated into the burgeoning Valyrian polity. 5 times had Old Ghis contended with Valyria when the world was young, and 5 times gone down to bleak defeat, for the freehold had dragons, and the Empire had none. The thoughts of Daenerys Stormborn. While it is often theorized that the Valyrians adopted slavery from the very peoples they had conquered and enslaved, they certainly added their own flair to the process, as the freehold was transformed into a society based upon the efforts of the slaves who toiled within the 14 Flames. These slaves extracted ever greater amounts of precious metals and jewels, which brought a previously unheard of degree of wealth and prosperity to the Valyrians. For at this point in the history of Essos, no other political entity could possibly stand in the way of the freehold, who would dominate affairs for centuries to come. Yet, as in all things, nothing lasts forever. Although the memories of Old Ghis and its empire remained firmly within the minds of the former citizens of the lands, the sons and daughters of the ancient Harpy had been annexed into the freehold, and were now either citizens or slaves of the Valyrian state. This subjugation and subsequent integration resulted in the Ghiscari people abandoning the Ghiscari tongue in favour of speaking High Valyrian. From the Ghiscari, the practice of slavery en masse was adopted by the Valyrians, and although the former slave masters of Ghis would be the first to feel the cruelty of Valyrian whips, they would be far from the last. For while the former citizens of the Old Empire were forced to mine within the depths of the 14 Flames for increasing quantities of copper, tin, iron, gold, and silver, the greed of their Valyrian masters continued to grow unabated. The death wrought at the hands of the slave masters of Old Valyria is truly beyond comprehension, and as slaves continued to die under brutal conditions in those cursed volcanic mines at unsustainable rates, the Valyrians could think of only one solution to this unfortunate issue: conquest. The Valyrian freehold would expand in all directions. To the east, they launched expeditions beyond even the Ghiscari cities they had acquired. To the west, the Dragon Riders pushed to the west coast of Essos, where they founded several colonies, such as Myr, Lys, Pentos, and Volantis. In the present day, these urban centres still exist as independent city-states. Within a few years, the Valyrians had created an empire which dwarfed even Old Ghis at its maximum territorial extent. The origin of each city was as diverse and varied as those who would come to dwell within these metropolises. The cities of Qohor and Norvos came into being following religious schisms in the Valyrian heartland, whereas Old Volantis and Lys were trading settlements first and foremost, founded by the merchant class and those wealthy enough amongst the nobility to purchase the right to independent rule as clients rather than direct subjects of the Valyrian freehold. While the sources are far from consistent on the point in question, it is believed that Pentos and Lorath were founded prior to the coming of the Dragon Lords and chose to pay homage to the evidently militarily superior Valyrians, and as such were able to retain the right to self-rule. The Valyrian stock amongst these cities was composed of residents of the Valyrian heartland who left behind their native peninsula in order to get away from the constant infighting of the major families in their homeland. Of all the cities that sprouted up during the Valyrian Golden Age, Braavos is by far the most unique. In a tale which is still retold even in an era in which the blood of Old Valyria has almost entirely run dry, it is said that Braavos stood not by the will of the Dragon Lords, but by those they sought to subdue, and who subsequently rebelled. During the time of the expansion, a gargantuan slaver fleet returning from the Summer and Jade Seas was faced with a massive rebellion, further exacerbated by a mutiny of the non-Valyrian oarsmen. The slaves below the galley decks broke their chains, slew their masters, and seized control of the sizable fleet. After this, these escapees sought out a place in which their would-be enslavers could not hope to find them. It is believed that the Moonsingers laid down a prophecy that the fleet would have to travel to the far northern corner of Essos, a land of fog, mud, and darkened water. There, the free city of Braavos was founded, and there it stood for centuries, hidden from the freehold. Even after they revealed themselves to the world, they would remain known as the Hidden City. However, not all peoples who dared to defy the will of the Dragon Lords did so in hiding. For those who could not suffer to live as slaves to the Valyrians, two options lay before them. They could fight, but this was a foolish endeavour, for dragonfire would brook no fools. The second option would be to flee. The first option had been undertaken wholeheartedly by the Empire of Old Gis, and their spectacular and violent downfall would call into question the feasibility of such an endeavour. The Rhoynar, the native water singers of the titular River Rhoyne, initially mounted a solid resistance against Valyrian expansion, and even managed to do the unthinkable by killing a few dragons. However, they would soon meet the same fate as another people who at one point had bordered them, the Andals. The Andals had long been a migratory people, rarely staying in one place or establishing firm roots. The earliest surviving histories suggest they originated from the lands of the Axe, east and north of modern-day Pentos. From these humble beginnings, the Andals would strike a path south and west, forging the realm of Andalos by displacing the native hairy men of that region through the might of their iron weapons and iron plate armor. In Andalos, it is believed that the Andals lived in peace for some time. However, events unfolding farther afield would soon bring the Valyrians to their doorstep. For a time, the Rhoynar served as the primary buffer between the Andals and Valyrian aggression. Holding the line at the mighty River Rhoyne, the Rhoynar defeated the Valyrian armies sent against them. Such was the strength of the Rhoynar at this point that they were comparable to that of Old Gis at its height, and a truce was declared between the freehold and their adversaries. At some point, the Valyrians established a truce with the Rhoynar and established a colony at the mouth of the River Rhoyne, the city of Valantis. This city flourished upon the trade that flowed along the arteries of that great river. It was here that the Valyrians would first come into contact with the Andals. A war of expansion into Andalos soon followed, and although Andal resistance was fierce, the strength of the ascendant Valyrian freehold was undeniable. Faced with an unstoppable tide of well-armed and armoured infantry and cavalry with experienced dragon riders at their head, the Andals were left with little choice but to give ground. They would initially surrender much of Andalos, retreating to the land of their forebears, the Axe. However, even these gains were insufficient to douse the flames of the Valyrian lust for conquest. As the Andals retreated ever further, eventually reaching the sea, many would have despaired, while many more steeled themselves for a final stand. This would prove futile, for those Andals who chose to fight were simply consumed by molten plumes of dragonfire. Nevertheless, the Andals refused to live under Valyrian overlordship. To that end, they constructed a great armada, crossed the narrow sea, and made war upon the first men of Westeros. This, however, is a tale for another series. With the Andals now out of reach of the Freehold's desperate slavers, the Valyrian Empire needed another source of forced manpower for the ever-escalating excavations beneath the 14 Flames. As such, the truce which had been formed with the Rhoynar seemed but a frail thing beneath the winds of change. Consequently, war erupted with the Children of the Rhoyne River once more, but the Rhoynar would prove to be a formidable adversary, possessing a form of water magic capable of countering dragonfire. The first outbreak of hostilities between the Valyrians and the Rhoynar became known as the First Turtle War, and would last little more than a moon's turn. This war occurred because the Valyrians butchered one of the giant turtles which dwelt upon the Rhoyne, and were believed to be the consorts of Mother Rhoyne herself. The Rhoynish city of Sarmel was subsequently raided and burned. However, the Rhoynar would ultimately emerge victorious. The famed Rhoynish water wizards called upon the power of the Rhoyne itself and flooded the Valyrian city of Volontheris. While the sources differ on the effect of the water magic, it is widely held that half the city was washed away. The wars waged between these two mighty peoples are beyond the ability of any chronicler to recount. Many more conflicts would be fought between them, such as the Second Turtle War, the Fisherman's War, the Salt War, the Third Turtle War, the War on Dagger Lake, and the Spice War. In spite of the sheer strength of the Valyrian freehold, the tail spear, turtle shell shield, and fish head helms of the Rhoynish warriors proved more than capable of exacting a bloody toll upon their neighbours. Despite the might of the Rhoynish people, most of these wars resulted in Valyrian victories, not only due to the strength of the Valyrian dragons, but also Valyrian political unity. Each Rhoynish city fought alone, fiercely independent, unyielding and unwilling to bend, while also remaining intransigent and unable to accept that aid from their distant kinsfolk would be required to stay the tide of Valyrian expansion. By way of comparison, the Valyrian colonies could count upon one another to provide aid throughout the continued outbursts of violence with their Rhoynish neighbours, and if necessary, they would call upon their counterparts within the freehold proper for aid. All of this changed with the sacking of Sahoi, the greatest of the Rhoynar cities which lay upon the Summer Sea. Its warriors were slaughtered, its women and children enslaved, and the city itself was razed to the ground. This caused a change in tact for the Rhoynish, who determined it necessary now to band together against a common foe. The city of Sahoi had been destroyed in the Second Spice War at the hands of a combined host of Valyrian soldiers and 3 dragon lords at their head. The destruction of the greatest and most beautiful city within the Rhoynish domains caused dramatic reverberations throughout Rhoynish society. The greatest of all the princes of Rhoynar, Garin of Troyan, declared to his people that they shall all be slaves unless we join together to end this threat. Whilst the decision to unify his people against the freehold was the wisest path to take, it remained to be seen if any force upon the far-reaching continent of Essos could stand against the dragon lords and their mighty hosts. A mighty warrior prince to his very core, Garin successfully called upon his brethren to join with him in washing away the Valyrian taint within his homeland. However, this great alliance was not free from detractors. Chief among them was Nymeria, the princess of Nyssa, who declared, "This is a war we cannot hope to win." In this discourse, she was shouted down as all of the other princes declared for Garin. Nymeria's warriors likewise declared for Garin, forcing Nymeria to join in the Grand Alliance. Although Rhoynish strength had been diminished throughout the years of war with the Valyrians, especially after the sack of Sahoi, they remained a populous and warlike people. As such, Garin, with the support of the nobility of the Rhoyne, amassed the largest army ever seen in Essos within his capital of Troyan. The chronicler Beldekar has put the number of this mighty gathering of the Rhoynish at 250,000 strong. Every man capable of taking up arms from the headwaters of the Rhoyne down to each of her many mouths made their way to the festival city to join the great campaign against the freehold. Here the imperious Garin informed the princes and gathered swords that so long as they stayed in proximity to the Rhoyne, they need not fear the Valyrian dragons. The water wizards of the Rhoynish, empowered by Mother Rhoyne herself, would serve as an effective counterweight against the unstoppable bringers of fire and blood, or so Garin led his people to believe. However, Garin would not rely solely upon the magic employed by his water wizards, and would also draw upon his own military expertise and tact. To that end, the prince divided his mighty host into 3 separate armies, the first of which marched down the eastern bank of the Rhoyne, the second trailed along her western bank, and the last of which consisted of an immense fleet of war galleys which kept pace with the former 2 forces down the river. This last force would sweep the river, disposing of all Valyrian ships that could potentially harass or flank the eastern or western armies. Through this strategy, Garin essentially flung open the mighty gates of Troyan, from where his forces would usher forth, smashing Valyrian villages, towns, outposts and garrisons in their path. The first proper confrontation came in the city of Selhoris, where Garin's mettle would be tested for the first time. Selhoris was garrisoned by some 30,000 men, well provisioned and well fortified. However, the Rhoynish took the city by storm, slaughtering the garrison. The city of Valasar would fall soon after. These minor triumphs were encouraging to the Rhoynish cause, but neither of these outposts would match the challenge they faced at the city of Voluntheris. Here, at the head of the host of the Rhoynar, Garin faced off against 100,000 soldiers, 100 war elephants, and 3 dragon lords. The fighting was brutal, testing the Rhoynish coalition to its limits. Despite a bitter, blood-soaked melee, The result of the battle followed the same course as that of the previous battles for Solhoris and Velisar. Dragonfire consumed thousands of Garin's men, yet thousands more found shelter in the shallows of the river from the all-consuming wrath of the Valyrian mounts. Here, within the shallows of the Rhoyne, the water wizards called upon the strength of their deity to throw enormous waterspouts against the dragons of the Freehold. Rhoynish archers were subsequently able to bring down 2 of the 3 dragons, while the last of the dragons fled back to the Freehold upon wounded wings. Following on from this great victory, Mother Rhoyne herself crashed down upon Voluntheris with such rage that the city was swallowed whole. This divine intervention on the part of the Rhoynish deity led the mighty host to bestow upon their ruler the name Garin the Great, a name the supposed saviour of the Rhoynar took to with aplomb. As he continued the advance of his armies down the river, word came to Volantis of the coming of Garin the Great. Rather than give them a fight, they retreated behind their black walls. However, even behind such imposing fortifications, their safety was not certain against the massive army that Garin had brought to bear. As such, they appealed to the Freehold for aid. The winged bringers of devastation and destruction came at the call of the Volantines, not the 3 which Garin had dispatched at Voluntheris, but some 300 or more, if the tales passed down are to be believed. None could contend with the flames of the Freehold. Not even Garin the Great, fresh from his victories further up the Rhoyne, could pose more than a slight inconvenience to the Valyrians. The dragonfire which came slaughtered tens of thousands of the Rhoynish in a deluge of heat and spasmodic violence not seen since the wars with Old Geese. Many others rushed to the river, believing Mother Rhoyne would offer them protection from the Freeholders, only to drown in her bloodied waters. Garin the Great was taken alive in the conflict and forced to watch as his people were punished for their defiance. The combined Volantine and Valyrian host put the Rhoynish to the sword, in numbers so great as to turn the great harbour of Volantis red as far as the horizon. Following this crushing victory, the combined Volantine-Valyrian force moved north along the river in a punitive campaign to ensure none along the Rhoyne would ever rise against them again. Sarmel was brutally sacked as the Freeholders made their way ever closer to Troyan. Prince Garin was forced to watch the slow march to his home city, locked within a golden cage at the command of the Valyrians. From this cage, he would be forced to watch the destruction of the festival city within which his campaign had begun with such enthusiasm. At Troyan, Garin's cage was hung from the very walls of the city, as he was to be presented with a first-hand view of what was to come. The women and children, bereft of the protection of their husbands and fathers, who had died in Garin's gallant efforts further south, were enslaved en masse. The city itself now lay firmly within Valyrian control. However, Garin could not bear to witness what had become of his home. As such, his lips uttered a brutal curse upon the enslavers as he called upon Mother Rhoyne to avenge her children. That very night, Mother Rhoyne answered, and a great swell came upon the river. With much greater force than had ever before been witnessed, the Rhoyne broke its banks. A thick fog consumed the city upon the tides of the Rhoyne, and with it came the curse of Garin the Great. The Valyrian conquerors, so proud upon the backs of their dragons, began to fall foul of Greyscale, and one by one they would die from this brutal affliction. This tale is not an embellished one, however, as the explorer Lomas Longstrider later wrote of the drowned ruins which once made up the festival city of Troyan. Here the foul fog still lay, and wayward travellers infected by Greyscale and driven mad by its affliction were its only denizens. These lost and broken souls now posed a distinct danger to all who deigned to travel the Rhoyne, making use of the broken expanse of the former Bridge of Dream. Further up the Rhoyne, Princess Nymeria of Nysa received news of the shattering of the host of Garin the Great and the destruction of Sarmel and Troyan, which left her with a uniquely difficult choice to make. Knowing the same fate would await her own people, she made the decision to flee her own homeland. Nymeria subsequently gathered every vessel she could find that lay upon the mighty Rhoyne, filling them with all the women and children who yet resided in her city. The male residents of the city had died within Garin's great war with the Freehold, and as such, the fleet lacked much in the way of protection against those whom they would face upon their journey. Nymeria led her fleet down the Rhoyne, avoiding the Valyrians, passing by the ruined Rhoynish settlements, fields of slain Rhoynish warriors, and horrifyingly bloated floating corpses. In order to avoid Volantis, Nymeria took an older channel, which brought them to the Summer Sea. where once the city of Sahoi had stood. The legends state that Nymeria amassed a fleet of 10,000 ships. Beldekar believed that this number had been inflated almost tenfold, while others gave further varying figures. Regardless, it was a large number, primarily composed of rivercraft including skiffs, trading galleys, fishing boats and the like, crammed to the very rafters with women and children. Beldekar firmly insisted that only 1 in 10 of these ships were remotely seaworthy, with the first storm they encountered sinking some 100 vessels. The fleet limped to Basilisk Isles, where they were assaulted by the Corsair kings of Axile, incurring further losses. From there, the fleet managed to avoid being entirely enslaved by the Corsairs, taking once more to the sea and attempting to settle in Basilisk Point, in the inhospitable Sothoios. A year they would last in this brutal land, wherein they struggled to eke out even a bare existence. However, the breaking point came when they found that the residents of the settlement of Yin were found to have disappeared without a trace into the jungles of Sothoios overnight. Knowing Sothoios would be the end of them, Nymeria took her people to sea once more for a further 3 years, settling first in the Isle of Nath, then the Summer Isles, before eventually making their way to Westeros. Many of her people did not make it to Westeros, and to this day, isolated groups of Rhoynish still dwell upon the Stepstones, descended from those who were shipwrecked. Many more had their ships blown off course to Lys and Tyrosh, where they were enslaved. The remnants of Nymeria's 10,000 settled in Dorne, their safety sealed by Nymeria's marriage to Mors Martell, the local lord. Nymeria herself declared upon their successful landing in Dorne, "Our wanderings are at an end, and we have found a new home, and here we shall live and die." There they would be free from the Freehold's grasp, yet they could not fully escape the yoke of Valyrian overlordship for long, as the Valyrian domains, strength and base of operations were to be rocked by what was to come. Even beings of such strength and power as the Dragon Lords of Old Valyria could not truly escape the doom which long awaited them. By the end of the wars between Valyria and the Rhoynar, Prince Garin and his brave Rhoynish warriors had been vanquished, and the Valyrians ruled unopposed. The Freehold's new outposts stretched far and wide across Essos, accumulating ever more wealth within a realm that faced no viable external threats that the flames of the Dragon Lord's mounts could not overcome. At the zenith of their power, the extent of Valyrian domains extended from the Narrow Sea to Slaver's Bay, and from the Shivering Sea to the Summer Sea. In order to maintain the mining efforts conducted within the 14 Flames, vast numbers of slaves were brought in from across the Freehold to mine gold and silver. During this period, a mighty outpost was established on the barely hospitable isle that would come to be known as Dragonstone. The reasoning behind the construction of this mighty bastion has been lost to time. However, it has been theorized by the Maesters that it was built in order to preempt a crossing of the Narrow Sea and a potential Valyrian invasion of Westeros. No Westerosi king was fool enough to resist the machinations of the Freeholders during the construction of Dragonstone. However, some local lords did fight back, only to be overcome in short order. During this 200-year period, Valyrian steel would trickle into Westeros. In addition, a minor Valyrian house would establish roots in the western continent. House Targaryen made up one of the 40 Dragon Lord families of the Valyrian Freehold, and maintained closer relationships with their dragons than the other families. Although the Targaryens did not number amongst the most powerful of the constantly scheming great families, they did possess a substantial ace in the hole. In their last few years in Valyria, Daenerys Targaryen, the daughter of Lord Aenar, experienced visions of almighty destruction which would soon destroy their homeland. Aenar believed in his daughter's visions, and sold all of his estates in Valyria before relocating his house to Dragonstone in 114 BC. Some 12 years later, the Doom came to Valyria, vindicating the decisions of Aenar the Exile, which had been motivated by the visions of Daenerys the Dreamer. The cause of the Doom remains a mystery, one which has been discussed at length by Maesters, Septons, and everything in between. The vast majority of people hold to the reasoning that it was a natural disaster, caused by the eruption of all 14 flames at once, effectively engulfing the Freehold. The majority of Septons, too focused on their religion, promulgated the belief that it was a punishment wrought upon the Valyrians for their incestuous tendencies and worship of 100 gods. The preaching of Septon Bath also found a handful of ardent listeners who expressed a far different theory. They held that the Valyrians had used spells to tame the 14 flames for thousands of years. When the spells eventually faltered, the cataclysmic doom, which leveled the freehold, was all but inevitable. Many who believed the spell wards containing the 14 flames had failed believed that the cause of this had been the curse of Prince Garin the Great finally coming to fruition. Others believed that the doom was caused by the priests of the god R'hllor, who, using bizarre rituals, called down the fire of their god to punish their slave masters. Some also pushed a narrative that in the constant infighting and bickering of the great houses, too many of the great mages who held the wards in place were assassinated. Whatever the reason behind the doom, what can be said for certain is that it truly was a cataclysmic event, the likes of which had never been seen in recorded history. The Ascendant Freehold was levelled in the space of a few hours, and its mighty sorcerers and unstoppable dragon riders were destroyed. It is said that each and every hill within 500 miles sprung asunder, filling the air with fire and smoke. What emerged from these hills and mountains burned so hot and in such an all-encompassing manner as to consume even the fire-breathing dragons themselves. Ravines opened up in the ground and consumed temples, palaces, and towns alike. The lakes would either boil or turn to acid during these few hours, while fiery fountains spewed from the mountaintops, shooting rocks 1,000 feet into the air. Red clouds choked the air, and with them, thunderous showers of dragon glass stained with the black blood of demons rained down from the sky. Further north in the peninsula, the ground cracked, splintering and falling away, only to be replaced by the boiling sea, which rushed into the void left in the wake of the destruction. The mightiest city the world had ever known was destroyed in a heartbeat, its proud spires and opulent palaces razed to the ground as the freehold collapsed overnight. The lands of the long summer, which were considered some of the most fertile in Essos, were left as a scorched, blighted wasteland. The destruction of Valyria did not bring an end to bloodshed within Essos. In fact, it precipitated an era of unprecedented violence across the continent. Indeed, although the dragon riders of Old Valyria were brutal tyrants, their freehold had maintained some semblance of stability within Essos. This stability evaporated overnight after the Doom, resulting in a power vacuum that saw numerous actors rise up in an attempt to take their place. Before the Doom, the vast majority of the dragon riders were stationed in Valyria itself, meaning that the true strength of the freehold was wiped out in a matter of moments. The Targaryens survived in their outpost of Dragonstone, but the vast majority of dragon riders and their mounts had been wiped out in Hellflame. A number of dragon riders who had been in Tyrosh and Lys at the time of the Doom were spared the fate of their comrades, but it would not be enough to save the freehold. The myth of Valyrian invincibility had been broken overnight. The peoples of the free cities rose up and slaughtered the riders and their mounts, preventing them from exerting any form of influence in the brave new world quickly emerging in Essos. The historians of Qohor also hold that a certain dragon lord by the name of Orion resided within the city at the time of the Doom. Whether by reason of his charismatic nature or a greater degree of preparedness than his countrymen in Lys and Tyrosh, he was not slain in the streets of the city. Rather, Orion named himself the first Emperor of Valyria and inspired the Qohoric colonists to back his claim to the newly established empire. Orion flew off on the back of his mighty mount with 30,000 Qohoric warriors in his army, eager to lay claim to Valyria and re-establish the freehold in all but name. Ultimately, the Empire of Valyria was to be a short-lived entity, as neither Orion nor his host were ever seen again. With that, the Dragon Lords of Essos died out in their entirety. After this, Volantis, the mightiest of the free cities, claimed the mantle of Old Valyria without any hesitation. Those of noble Valyrian heritage who did not maintain dragons within their households called for war upon other free cities and came to be known as the Tigers. Initially, their campaigns were met with unadulterated success, as Lys and Myr soon fell within their dominion alongside the southern reaches of the Rhoyne. However, disaster struck when the Tigers overstretched themselves in their attempt to take Tyrosh. With this, their newly ascendant empire began to collapse. unadulterated Valyrian aggression caused Pentos to throw their lot in with Tyrosh. Furthermore, Myr and Lys rebelled, with the Sea Lord of Braavos providing a fleet of 100 ships to aid the rebels in Lys. Aid against the tyrannical Valyrians would even come from the most unexpected of lands, that of Westeros. The king of the Stormlands, Argilac the Arrogant, led a host of warriors from his homeland into the disputed lands due to the promises of gold and glory. During this campaign, they utterly routed a Valyrian host, which had been attempting to retake Myr. During the dying days of the conflict, even the future conqueror of Westeros, Aegon Targaryen, involved himself in the interregnum. Aegon was approached by Pentos and Tyrosh with petitions to join a grand alliance against Valentis. Though Aegon had set his attentions firmly to the west from an early age, in this instance he looked east and mounted the Black Dread to answer their call. He met with the Prince of Pentos and the Magisters of the Free Cities, and then rode Balerion to Lys, arriving in time to set a Valyrian fleet alight as it was preparing to invade the city. With basically everyone ganging up on Valentis, the city continued to suffer defeat after defeat, and the tide firmly swung against the mightiest of the Free Cities. At Dagger Lake, the fire galleys of Norvos and Qohor destroyed the vast majority of the Valyrian fleet which controlled the Rhoyne. The newly ascendant Dothraki also swarmed out of the Dothraki Sea, falling upon the much weakened Valentis. Finally, the Elephants, a faction composed of wealthy tradesmen and merchants, took power in Valentis and sued for peace. As for the nascent Aegon Targaryen, he quickly lost interest in the east. Soon after fulfilling his role in bringing low the Valyrians, he returned to Dragonstone, placing his full attention upon Westeros. The aforementioned Dothraki were great beneficiaries in the power vacuum left by the fall of the Freehold. During the ascension of the Horse Lords, the strongest among them, Khal Mengo, united the 60 Khalasars and turned their collective focus westwards. The tall men of Sarnor ignored this looming threat, instead utilizing the Dothraki in their own wars between their minor kingdoms. Mengo fought the Sarnoris' wars for them, but rather than handing off the lands he conquered back to his employers, he kept them, razing the towns, fields and farms, and causing them to return to the wild state which suited their mounts. The son of Mengo, Khal Morro, went on to destroy the finest city of the Sarnori people, Sathar. This caused further infighting amongst the Sarnori cities of Kasath and Gornath, both of whom laid claim to the ruins. Over the next 3 decades, the cities of Kasath, Gornath, Salosh, Kinth, Hornoth and Mardosh fell into the hands of the ever-splintering Dothraki hordes. Following the brutal sack of Mardosh, the Sarnori united against the Dothraki, amassing an army of 126,000 warriors, under the command of High King Mazor Alexi. However, King Mazor was far from the most competent of battle commanders, leading his army to the battlefield which would become known as the Field of Crows. The Sarnori army met the 4 Khalasars of the Dothraki on the open field. In total, the Dothraki horde numbered some 80,000 riders. The battle began with the vanguard of the tall men, some 60,000 scythed chariots, cutting a tremendous swathe through the Dothraki lines, killing Khal Harrow and routing his Khalasar. As the Dothraki retreated, the arrogant Mazor Alexi allowed his men to pursue. This was a trap, drawing the Sarnori into unfavourable terrain. This allowed Khal Kano to attack from the north, Khal Zako from the south, and Khal Losso from the rear. Mazor Alexi was slain in the ensuing bloodbath alongside his entire host, with over 100,000 Sarnori put to the sword. As the century of blood drew to a close, every Sarnori city fell to the hands of the Dothraki, with Saris being the last to fall at the hands of Khal Zego. To this day, the only enclave of Sarnori that remains is the much diminished city of Sath. The Dothraki then spread out, establishing a mighty domain known as the Dothraki Sea. This created a new and altogether unstable balance of power in the region, with the Dothraki taking the place of the Valyrian Freehold as the predominant powerhouse in Essos. The world was altered as much by the rise of the Freehold as by its fall. Such was the power exerted and wonders achieved by the simple shepherds who had emerged from the Valyrian Peninsula. Yet even with a pale reflection of old Valyria left in the world in the guise of the Targaryens, the Freehold's true strength and the will which it could exert upon the world was not entirely extinguished. This brings us to the end of our series on the history of the Valyrian Freehold and all that its power and majesty wrought upon the world, but we're planning to cover the battles of many other fantasy, sci-fi and space opera universes, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description to know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our Discord and much more. This is the Wizards and Warriors channel, and we will catch you on the next one.